My mortal enemy. Until Joe Mufro, I never thought I'd have a mortal enemy again. Then Joe came back from the Second World War, tearing through the St. Anne River Valley in the fancy new car his daddy bought him, throwing around the money his daddy gave him, and convincing his daddy to start in on a fancy new way to just log the holy hell out of the St. Anne. I pegged Joe Mufro the moment I first saw him as a lying, foolish, condescending idiot, well worth my bitter spite. And I gotta hand it to him. Joe did a bang-up job as my mortal enemy for most of my life. Now look at me, lying here in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and applesauce to eat. Yesterday afternoon I was drinking at the Brothers' Suite, watching the soaps. I was 99 years old, sure, but still I was in my prime, full of Rainier and vinegar, fixing to live forever. Then along came Joe Mufro, as short-necked, spindle-armed, light-beer-drinking, milk-chasing, fast-food-smelling, big-talking, nervous guffawing, flabby-handled, free-loading, sideways-glancing, barrel-chested, jolly-weaselingly poor a substitute for the Grim Reaper as fate could supply. Maybe I shouldn't be so gobsmacked. After all, me and Joe were set at odds from the beginning, and over time, the knowledge of his essential wretchedness has come to shape my belief that our mortal enemies can keep us alive. So despite everything that's happened, maybe I owe him my gratitude. Maybe Joe, with his 4 jet skis, his Harley-Davidson and his hundreds of channels, his house, that enormous fake log cabin-style Goliath more plastic than pine, his whoop-de-doo gas barbecue range and his clear-cuts, was keeping me alive the whole time. Still, there comes a time with mortal enemies when you have to have it out with them. It may not be a time or place of your own choosing, but in order to outlive somebody, one of you has to die. There are plenty of ways that I could have left this life with more dignity than at Joe Mufro's hand. You could search the great, wide supermarket of human experience and find a million other fates that would go down easier than this particular brand of humiliation. Still, if you think that I care, you're wrong. Maybe for some it's a scary thing to be small, but I'm not scared. My name is Weldon Applegate, and I've been small before. And anyway, it's not like Joe emerged from the field of battle covered in glory either. Having mortal enemies was one of the ways my father and I were always different. Tom Applegate never seemed to have any enemies at all, mortal or otherwise. He was always affable, always kept an open countenance, and from the moment we first set foot in the tiny timber town of Cordelia when I was 10 years old, he'd been respected as an Applegate, whose father and grandfather had both been famous lumberjacks in their times. We'd made quite a stir, my father and me, when Peg Ramsey brought us to his tiny town to run the general store after Lyle Llewellyn died. All who had heard stories of the Applegates tipped their caps in respect, and of course everyone knew about the lost lot and how it was my father's by inheritance and still untouched. As we walked through the mud of Main Street, Peg had asked my father if he liked Cordelia. My father had said yes, oh yes, he liked it. He was a romantic, my dad. There had been a time in his youth, before I was born, when my father could have taken to the woods for good. He had worked in the timber around the Montana border with his own father for several seasons, and was good at it. His father, Old Tom, had followed the big trees to the St. Anne, and my father would have gone as well, but for meeting my mother. He stood squarely behind her in their wedding photo, his big hand on her tiny shoulder, his thick, powerful body jammed into wedding attire, looking every bit the caged woods beast. There was kindness and humor in his eyes, but also a glint of good-time mischief and hard work. He'd met my mother on a trip to Moscow, Idaho. She was working behind the counter at her family's store. The match was lopsided for sure. Her family well-to-do, my father so poor he could barely afford to whistle a tune. But they had fallen in love, and you know how that goes. My mother was no fool, though, and lumberjacking, with its dangers, deprivations, and enforced absence, was no way to raise a family if you could possibly avoid it. She promised to marry him if he'd leave the woods behind. So, he made her the damn oath. It couldn't have been easy. Jacking was the only life my father, and his father before that, had ever known. Cut those men and they would have bled pine sap. But he said yes, of course, and they settled down, and I came along. To my childish eyes, he seemed happy and content. He wasn't one of those fathers who seethed or brooded. His face was placid as a bucket of milk. Even when word came that his own father had died working in the tall timber, he took the news in stride. You'd have thought at least that when the deed to the lost lot arrived with my grandfather's axe and the rest of his few personal possessions, that it would have had some effect on his self-control. But no. That craggy, tree-covered jut of mountain was just a place on some map to him. He hadn't seen it with his own eyes yet. And anyway, my father had made an oath to leave the woods behind, and that was that. At least that's what I thought.